here in just a second. Well, welcome everyone. On behalf of Penn State Sustainability Institute, my colleagues and I welcome you to the Pennsylvania event for Solve Climate by 2030. Tonight, we are joining thousands of people nationwide in advancing the knowledge, values, and ideas that can help us more rapidly draw down greenhouse gas emissions and make a better life for us, our children, friends, families, and neighbors, and the myriad creatures we share our state and the planet with. As employees of the land-grant University of Pennsylvania, founded under Abraham Lincoln's administration and committed through our strategic plan to taking on climate change, we recognize that Pennsylvania has a unique role to play in energy, agriculture, land use, transportation, our general ways of life, and yes, even those dreaded words, politics and policy. We also recognize that climate change is not entirely separate from the COVID-19 crisis that's hitting us today. They're stacked on top of one another, and we don't want to lose sight of that and the work that all of you are doing to stay safe and take care of one another. In just a few minutes, I'll turn it over to Grant Ervin, the Chief Sustainability Officer for the City of Pittsburgh, who will MC and moderate the event and introduce our three really incredible panelists from across Pennsylvania. But before that, I have to say that the views expressed by our panelists do not necessarily reflect the views of Penn State nor Penn State's Sustainability Institute. Now, we're going to turn the floor over to Dr. Eben Goodstein, the director of Bard College's Center for Environmental Policy, the organizer of the national and international event. Let's hear from Eben. Next.
Welcome to Solve Climate by 2030. Today, universities in almost all 50 U.S. states, Puerto Rico, D.C., and several other countries are hosting state and region-wide webinars focused on ambitious and feasible things that we can all do in our cities, our towns, and states in the coming year to really move the needle on climate change. Here is the most important idea to take home today. What you do locally will change the future. Fact. The U.S. state of Georgia is a top 10 solar state. The neighboring Sunshine State of Florida has very little solar power due to outdated laws and regulations. When we launched Solve Climate a year ago, we could never have imagined that today, entire countries and much of the world's economy would be shut down, with hundreds of thousands of people ill, thousands having passed away, and our health systems overwhelmed. I take that back. We could easily have imagined this. Our health experts and scientists warned us this was coming. After SARS and MERS, they told us this was coming, and yet we didn't take preventive action, we didn't prepare. COVID-19 has shown how fragile our health and economic systems are to extreme events. Our scientists have told us clearly that unchecked, climate change will turn our lives into an unending series of extreme events. Floods, droughts, rising sea levels, pests and disease, more extreme storms and hurricanes, all of this leaving hundreds of millions of people homeless and on the move. We can change this. We still have time to change that future. Last year, the world's top climate scientists told us that we have until 2030, 10 years now, to cut global warming pollution aggressively in order to stabilize the climate at the low end. That warning was the genesis for this national and international discussion today on how to solve climate by 2030. Solving climate in 10 years, that sounds challenging. And yet fixing the energy half of climate change by 2030 is looking more, not less likely than it was 4 years ago. The cost of solar and wind power, batteries, and electric vehicles have plummeted. In many cases, they are less expensive now than the fossil fuel power that causes global warming, and they are getting cheaper every day. Already, utility-scale wind and solar, big solar and wind farms that feed power into the grid, these technologies are crushing fossil fuels in much of the U.S. In Colorado, Idaho, and California, renewable bids are coming in at half the price that the cheapest fossil fuel plants can do. And this is where rooftop solar and battery systems are headed in the near future. On the vehicles front, all the major manufacturers see this coming. Mercedes-Benz announced last fall that they have designed their last gasoline-powered car. Going forward, every new model of theirs will be electric. Combining electric-powered vehicles with the impact of driverless technology, we could see a very rapid transition away from gasoline-based cars to EVs in the next decade. All this progress was the result of a major technology push by national governments. Starting in America in the 70s and then ramping up with the Danes, the British, the Japanese and Koreans, the Germans, and most recently the Chinese and Indians, government policies have brought these industries to scale. And now the market is taking over, and renewables, battery storage, and electric vehicles are on track to deliver power and transportation at prices unsubsidized that will lead to major disruptions of energy markets in the 2020s. Can we get there fast enough to solve climate? Well, this is where you come in. With plummeting prices for renewables and electric-powered transports, the pace of the clean energy revolution will no longer be determined by Washington, D.C. and other national governments. Instead, the core action is going to be in your city, at your electric utility, and in your state capital. The key to solving climate by 2030 will be clearing the path at the local level to rapid deployment of solar, wind, battery storage, and electric vehicles. We need to get rid of outmoded laws and regulations that are holding back the transition. Florida needs to take the lesson from Georgia. It's imperative that we have justice in this transition. We have to make sure that the millions of green jobs that are created are jobs for all, and that everyone has access to clean, affordable power and mobility. Today, in Nebraska and New Jersey, in Idaho and Alabama, in Bangladesh and Brazil, we're going to find out what are 3 ambitious but feasible things that we can do right at home to smooth the path for clean energy and to bring energy justice to our communities. Following the webinar, I hope you will join a group or class discussion about what you can do to make these solutions real. Then, what next? Well, this summer, young people in particular have a terrific opportunity to both support climate solutions and gain valuable job skills in a down economy. The most powerful thing you can do to solve climate by 2030 is to join the political campaign of a candidate who best represents your views on climate solutions. In doing that, you'll also learn how to communicate, you'll gain courage, and most importantly, be part of a creative, strong, powerful vision for the future. COVID-19 is giving us a stark lesson about what happens when we ignore warnings from science. Today, we'll see how 10 years can be enough time to drive the climate solutions that we need, and that the future will be what we make it. Thank you for the work you will do to solve climate.
Great. Well, it was great to hear from Eben. And thank you all once again on behalf of Penn State's Sustainability Institute. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Grant Ervin, who will take over for the rest of the webinar.
Great. Thanks, Peter. And thank all of you for joining us here today. It's a great pleasure to connect with everyone, albeit virtually. Hopefully the day will come soon where we'll all have the ability to be together and connect in person. Tonight we have a really great conversation with some of Pennsylvania's foremost leaders in climate with us to share some of their insights on the work that they're doing and helping to progress and propel Pennsylvania forward on the issues related to climate change. Jackie Bonomo is the Executive Director of PennFuture, Joylette Portlock, Executive Director of Sustainable Pittsburgh, and Hannah Smith-Brubaker, Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Association for Sustainable Agriculture. Each of the speakers tonight will have the opportunity to share a few slides and some thoughts and some initial reflections in presentations. Then we'll have the opportunity to provide some questions and answers, which I will start first with a few kind of kickstart questions to start the conversation. And then we'll also be looking for audience participation. So as each speaker begins their presentation, please start to think about some of the questions that you would want to ask of them to help further the dialogue. Without further ado then, I'd like to ask Jackie to begin her presentation and share some of her reflections with us. Jackie?
Well, thanks, Grant. I'm really honored to be asked to be part of this teach-in. I'm Jackie Bonomo and I'm president of PennFuture. So my organization is a statewide environmental advocacy organization working for clean air, clean water, clean energy, and a healthy climate. Our work is focused mostly here in Pennsylvania. We've got 5 offices around the state. But we have two important partnerships worth mentioning that add color to our reach. First is our alliance with Conservation Voters of Pennsylvania. CVPA notably produces a scorecard that rates how state elected officials voted on environmental issues in Pennsylvania. And we're affiliated with the National Wildlife Federation, and that relationship provides us a strong link to what's happening on policy and legislation in the United States Congress and in Washington, D.C. I know online tonight with us is the interested public at large, and that's great. But I also want to extend my thanks to the young people on the call with us, because you've been on my mind so much lately. I'm really grateful for the work of our youth climate strikers. And so if any of you are with us tonight online, this is a shout out for all of you. Can I have the first slide, please? So by way of introduction, I've spent a lot of time lately reflecting on how I've come to this moment, partially because the pandemic emergency is calling for us to reflect, but also because we're approaching the 50th anniversary of the first Earth Day, which took place on April 22nd, 1970. This is the front page of my hometown newspaper from that day. In 1970, I was 13 years old and in 8th grade. I was attending a Catholic grade school, and my education there was really progressive. So we were taking part in the protests to end the Vietnam War, and we're witnessing the evolution of the civil rights movement, the emergence of the Black Power movement, the assassinations of beloved leaders, and the unrest and dissatisfaction spilling out onto campuses violently, like at Penn State University in Ohio, and peacefully at other institutions and communities. But those times, and the fact that even as a 13-year-old, I was able to find ways to be involved, whether they were facilitated by my school or by a parent, greatly influenced my desire and my ability to want to change the world and to eventually dedicate myself to try to do just that. Can I have the next slide, please? Along with that, I guess you can say that I'm a product of the coal fields. And even though I've lived in many places throughout our beautiful country and have done environmental work in 24 different states and territories, I'm back living in Luzerne County in the heart of what was once anthracite coal country. My grandfather was an illiterate Italian immigrant. He worked in the mines and was as exploited by his union as he was by the coal companies. Two of my uncles worked on the steam shovels that stripped away the land until the coal lying underneath could be exposed and dug out by giant buckets at the end of those steam shovels. My uncle's jobs was literally to climb out onto the ends of those shovels, at the ends of the arms of those shovels, and oil the buckets and their parts. Another uncle, John Stevens, died when the steam shovel he was operating was buried by a massive landslide. He left behind my aunt and a 4-year-old cousin. The fossil fuel industry has exploited the families, communities, landscape, and legislature of Pennsylvania for far too long, and it needs to stop. Can I have the next slide? So oil, coal, and gas have defined Pennsylvania's identity and shaped our economy for over 200 years. If we continue in this direction, we're cornering ourselves into a future where we will have no choice but to live with the impacts to our health and our climate for generations to come. The climate crisis is begging us to have an orientation toward a different future. But here in Pennsylvania, the pull of history, the pull of geography, and the pull of geology is strong and undisputed. Next, please. We've been mining coal here in Pennsylvania since the 1700s, since just 14 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed. Coal and mining was essential to this state and to families like mine and to the success of the whole country, but its heyday is past. Here's the legacy of what coal mining has left us. Tens of thousands of lives have been lost in mining accidents, and many more have been lost to a horrendous disease called black lung. Over 5,000 miles of Pennsylvania's 83,000 miles of stream have been polluted by mine drainage. Over 200 acres of abandoned mine lands exist statewide, including 252 miles of unreclaimed and dangerous high walls. We've got over 1,200 open portals and vertical mine shafts, 38 underground mine fires, and thousands of acres and tons of coal piles and subsidence-prone land. And still, coal-burning power plants here have dumped tons upon tons of climate-killing pollution into our atmosphere. Have the next slide, please. Now, back in 1859, George Bissell and Edward Drake made the first successful use of a rig on a well drilled specifically to produce oil on a site at Oil Creek in northwestern Pennsylvania. After that happened, petroleum became an industry in the United States, and less than 20 years later, gas began to be extracted from shallow wells in Murraysville near Pittsburgh. Today, 200,000 unplugged legacy wells from those times still exist, and it's going to take $8.4 billion for us to address. These wells leak methane constantly, a potent greenhouse gas. But despite these truths from 200 years of this industry and this legacy of environmental and public health harm from fossil fuels, and despite the climate emergency, in 2004, Pennsylvania opened its arms to fracking companies that wanted to access deep gas in the Marcellus Shale Formation. Today, Pennsylvania is the second largest producer of frack gas in the country. As of September 2019, Pennsylvania has experienced quarter after quarter increases in shale gas production for at least the past 13 quarters. That's over 3 years worth of record production of frack gas. Can I have the next slide, please? And this is what the past 10 years of fracking looks like. Now the next slide, please. And this is what the underlying infrastructure looks like. Pipelines, gas compressing facilities, gas processing facilities, compressor stations, oil and gas disposal sites, underground storage facilities, the list goes on. So lots and lots of fracking and drilling here, and lots of gas to sell, and lots more left in the ground. And so this powerful industry has decided at this point in time to hang its future not only on frack gas for energy, but also now on petrochemicals and plastics. All this gas needs a market. So in 2016, Pennsylvania opened its arms to Royal Dutch Shell, inviting it here to build the infamous ethane to plastics cracker plant being built in Beaver County outside of Pittsburgh near the Ohio border. We offered Shell a subsidy package totaling $1.6 billion. According to Good Jobs First subsidy tracker, Shell ranks 7th among the companies that have generated the most public subsidies in the United States. This $1.65 billion package that Pennsylvania offered Shell is over 15 times the size of the next largest corporate subsidy ever offered in Pennsylvania. Shell's cracker will be permitted to pump out 522 tons of volatile organic compounds into the air, nearly double the amount being emitted by the state's current largest source, which is U.S. Steel's Clarendon Coke Works. The cracker plant will soak nearby communities in toxics. And as to the climate impacts, Shell is permitted to produce 2.25 million tons of carbon dioxide every year. That means this one plant will yield a carbon footprint 1/3 the size of our largest cities. And 3 or 4 more cracker plants are being planned here. In addition to being a climate killer, early days of what this triumvirate of fracking, petchem, and plastics will leave as its legacy in Pennsylvania is just now beginning to reveal itself as we grapple to understand radioactive water, cancer clusters, and low birth rate babies. And while this industry appears to be no different from its coal, oil, and shallow gas well bedfellows, exploiting workers and communities, destroying health, boom and bust cycles, strand and abandon, this time around, we have a fossil fuel industry that will knowingly exact a toll on our climate in a time of crisis. Can I have the next slide, please? These are just some of the celebratory social media posts that were put out by state agencies and the governor, many of them lapdogs for this industry. Notice, we didn't say yes to Shell. Shell said yes to us. We have a pro-gas governor who believes that gas can be extracted safely. Our state legislature is improving, but the majority Republican Party is largely captured by gas lobbyists and contributions. Since 2007, the industry has given over $11 million to political campaigns, committees, and parties here in Pennsylvania. And there are currently more industry lobbyists in our state capital, Harrisburg, than there are legislators. Can I have the next slide, please? So ground zero for this industry is in Western Pennsylvania, and we're fighting in solidarity with Ohio and West Virginia as the Upper Ohio River Basin comprises the site of a proposed massive petrochemical hub and storage facility. We're concerned by the sprawl of petchem infrastructure into the rest of the state. This industry is quietly cultivating economically vulnerable communities who would love to be home to one of the additional cracker plants the industry is touting that Pennsylvania frack gas can support. In Philadelphia, we must decide on the future of the Pennsylvania Energy Solutions refinery and if that will be reopened. There are rumors of a cracker plant in northeastern Pennsylvania. Erie is already home to plastics manufacturing that can easily be expanded using frack gas. Liquefied natural gas facilities are taking shape along the river, the upper Susquehanna River. Exxon is shopping for new sites in Westmoreland, Greene, and Washington counties, and pipelines everywhere are making the expansion of this industry easy. So that, for me, is the crux of Pennsylvania's climate crisis. Pennsylvania must break away from fossil fuels, most notably the threat of more frack gas to be used for energy, plastics, and petrochemicals. Now I need to say a little bit about the most important things, and that's what you can do. Can I have the next slide, please? So I know this might sound trite, but the first thing that I'm asking you to do is commit tonight, here and now, to do something about our planet, our climate, and our future. Slam down on the pedal and never let up until something changes. I'm urging you to make this lifelong commitment. Next slide, please. You must vote. Make sure you're registered to vote, and make sure that everyone you know who is eligible to vote is registered to vote. And make sure that everyone you know who is registered to vote actually votes. This year, we'll be electing a new president. At next year, Pennsylvania elects a new governor. We must make sure that gubernatorial wannabes engage in a dialogue around Pennsylvania's climate and energy future, and that voters understand what's at stake. This may be our last chance to elect a climate leader. If we don't, we'll enter a lost decade leading us right up to 2030, and after that, we can assume the worst. Next slide, please. Last, and in my mind, this is a real game changer. We need to see a flood of people who care about our climate to run for office starting now. Think about it. I hope you'll consider this. Can I have the next slide, please, showing our credits? Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to talking to you.
Thank you, Jackie. We greatly appreciate your slides and your insights. I would like to turn the floor over to Dr. Joylette Portlock from Sustainable Pittsburgh. Joylette.
Thanks so much, Grant. Excuse me, my voice is from lack of use sitting here. It's unusual for a few minutes to be quiet, I feel. But thank you, first of all, to the organizers for inviting me to participate in today's event. And thank you to everybody for joining in on this important topic, near and dear to my heart. Of course, my background is in science. I have a PhD in genetics, so laboratory science is where my training has been. But I worked for a number of years, several years, in climate change education and communication. So this is really a subject that I've cared a lot about for a long time. And I don't have a number of meaningful personal stories from coal country, as we just heard from Jackie. But I've been in Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania, since 2007, and I'm from, so I understand that context, and I'm from a small town in Delaware, a coastal town, which is basically at sea level. So facing a very sobering future for my hometown, almost no matter what we do at this point. So I think no matter where we live, anywhere on this whole world, you know, climate change is global. So the COVID-19 era, of course, is looming large today, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit, touching on the places where these crises are somewhat similar and can inform one another, give you a little bit of background on Sustainable Pittsburgh, some big picture perspective, and talk a little bit about our work and what you can do. So if I can have the next slide. Thanks. And I apologize for the low resolution nature of this picture. Sustainable Pittsburgh has for 21 years worked with decision makers in southwestern Pennsylvania and through some statewide programs across the state, statewide programs and efforts to advance a healthy environment, good quality of life, and economic prosperity for all. We talk about sustainability in the comprehensive definition. Could I have the next slide? Which is defined in this way by the Brundtland Commission from the United Nations as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Next slide. As I talk about it, it sits at the intersection sustainability of economic prosperity, environmental stewardship, and social equity, meaning, in short, creating communities that are built to last, equitable, resilient, healthy, prosperous places for us to live, work, and play. So I mentioned giving a little bit of perspective. Could I have the next slide? This is an image that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. This is the pale blue dot photo taken by the Apollo spacecraft as it exited our solar system. And the late, great science fiction author, writer, thinker, Carl Sagan said of this photo, he said, "That's here, that's home. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam." And I like to start every presentation that I give pretty much with this photo because I think there's no better way to kind of describe the finite nature of our planet. And that leads me to my first take-home message from my reflections. Could I have the next slide? Which is that this separation, this idea we have of the human world being separate from the natural world is an artificial separation. And to really grapple with our global challenges around climate, around plastics pollution, around any number of important environmental issues, we really need to grapple with this, this idea that we're not actually separate from the rest of the natural world. It's a fiction. We are always part of it. And that interaction is where we need to be focusing and spending our work. Could I have the next slide? This is, for instance, 3 largish mammals in a marine environment. Next slide. This is a picture of beautiful fall colors here in southwestern Pennsylvania. It also happens to be, next slide, my backyard, which is in, next slide, the wilderness of Swissvale, Pennsylvania. Nature is always around us, always, and we are always having an impact on the world around us, big and small. And as you know, there's no bigger impacts right now than are happening with climate change. Next slide. So there are a number of human health effects from climate change. One of my roles in the community is serving on the Allegheny County Board of Health, in addition to my role at Sustainable Pittsburgh. We took a look at this a number of years ago in terms of the human health effects of climate change that are going to be important increasingly in southwestern Pennsylvania, and there are a number of them. Could I have this list? I guess there's, I think, 5 things on this list. Heat-related mortality, changes in spread of infectious disease, respiratory illness from poor air quality, increases in allergen load, and flooding and deterioration of water quality. And so you can immediately see there's a couple of these which are very close tie-ins to the public health crisis that we're currently facing with COVID-19, making clear that, you know, thinking about things through the health lens is an important way to have these discussions and grapple with these. I think one of the most compelling ways that we can talk about climate change, in fact, is with these impacts to health. These are just the impacts that we're expecting to see here in southwestern Pennsylvania. There are a number that aren't listed here that are important in other places in the eastern part of the state and globally in terms of sea level rise. But one of the things I wanted to call out, and this was in the introductory video as well, and the reason that we focus in part on social equity is because these topics are interrelated. Next slide. The impacts and risk of climate change, as with COVID-19, frankly, are not distributed evenly across the population. These are this is just a chart showing poverty rates for counties in the Pittsburgh region. Next slide. And if we see, look a little more carefully, we see that these risks are really not distributed equally when we start talking about racial equity. Some of these numbers are a little dated now, from 2014, I believe, or 2012. Grant may have additional information. I know he keeps very close watch on these things, at least in the Pittsburgh region, so we can talk about that more in questions. But whether it's COVID-19 or climate change, we know that the people with the fewest resources, who are the least resilient, are going to be hurt the most. So one way that's been developed to grapple with this interconnectedness is through the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide. Which at the first glance looks like all the world's problems are kind of divvied up into 17 boxes. But what I really like about this framework is that it really is an important way to grapple with the complexity, right? Because if you start digging down into what each of these categories measures, you start to quickly see the interconnectedness. You know, you can't talk about climate, as we just talked about, without talking about health, which is, you know, number 3, and we can't talk about that without talking about poverty, which is UN Sustainable Development Goal number 1. So at Sustainable Pittsburgh, we have kind of four buckets of work that we engage in. Next slide. Those are informing policy, which is largely informing about policy. We work with a number of decision makers, sharing info that can help raise awareness about and inform development of policy. We work to build communities of practice, which I'll talk a little bit about, gathering cohorts of folks together to learn and engage. We work to shape the regional narrative and really talk in a different way and bring different issues to light than are part of that traditional narrative around our economic drivers here. And we provide expertise to the community at large and to a number of different constituents. So policy, we've already talked about a lot in this conversation. The reason that that's important, next slide, is illustrated here in my next couple of slides. So this is and I apologize for that. That is, 1 second. Sorry about that. We're all grappling with the virtual world. This is a picture of springtime in 2090 in the US, based on the National Climate Assessment that was published in 2014. This is if we do not do anything to address our carbon emissions. But what you see very clearly is that if we do actually start to address our carbon emissions in a serious way, next slide, that picture changes dramatically. Where we once were seeing 30% increases and decreased swings in the amount of precipitation across the country, we now are seeing much less. Some of the changes are things we will not be able to escape, but there is a lot of difference that can still be made, and that's why this is so important. Next slide. So one of the major ways that we act to address these things are through programs that bring businesses, municipalities, folks from all different sectors together and with each other to learn and to have impact. Next slide. We're connected to hundreds of organizations through our performance programs and our targeted collaborative projects where we recognize and foster collective impact. Next slide. Our cohorts include 108 municipalities across the state, as well as these 41 companies where we host the CEOs for Sustainability Executive Roundtable, which provides regional leadership in the business sector. And we are connected to hundreds of restaurants and small businesses who right now in this era are very focused on incredibly immediate concerns around short-term sustainability. But one of the things that I think that we will get to talk about is the ways in which the era in which we now find ourselves, may be an opportunity to re-examine and be thoughtful about the ways that we move forward and as we recover from the COVID-19 era. can build more sustainable practices into our society. Next slide. Shaping the regional narrative is so important to this conversation about how we might be able to do some of that re-examination. That's also work we do. This is a sculpture that we built out of waste plastics a year and a half ago. And we worked to, next slide, track and measure regional sustainability, and are engaged right now in collaborative work around how to build better tracking systems for some of the metrics that really matter. You know, what gets measured gets managed, and it's really important for us to be doing a good job of measurement as we move forward. Next slide. In short, sustainability means owning and understanding that the separation between our human spaces and the natural spaces that we like to think about that separation is artificial. Next slide. This is nature. Next slide. And this is also nature, although it is very also clearly impacted by human activity. This is a windmill farm in Bradford County, Pennsylvania. And that I like this slide because I think it very clearly illustrates some of the choices that we have as possibilities to make, and in a very visual way. That pond in the center of the photograph is a fracking fluids reservoir. Next slide. So if I have two take-home messages, the first is being that the separation from the natural world is an artificial separation. It doesn't really exist. The second take-home is this: a collective problem requires collective action. Collective action is the only thing that is what got us into this when we start talking about our climate challenges, and it's the only thing that can get us out. What we're doing to build resilience and protect all people and make sure that we can meet the challenges of today hinges on our ability to work together and to engage with others. I have noticed over years, you know, that individual fear and guilt around climate change really only gets us so far. You know, it's really important for us to engage. Next slide. This is something of an incomplete list of the number of nonprofits in the Pittsburgh region that are focused on these issues besides Sustainable Pittsburgh. Nationally, of course, you've got a number of organizations: Climate Reality Project, National Resources Defense Council, Sierra Club, statewide organizations, great organizations like PennFuture. For youth-focused organizations, you know, everyone involved in the Power Shift Network, the Sunrise Movement, and yes, the Youth Climate Strikers. Individual actions do matter. If there's a call to action, however, that I have for you today, it is to engage, to find one of these organizations or groups that is working in ways that speak to you, and engage. Volunteer, intern, figure out some kind of way to engage with them, because that is really how we get this done together. Next slide. And so I'm going to close kind of the way I opened with another less well-known, I think, part of that Carl Sagan quote about the pale blue dot. He said, also, in our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. So I'll close there, and I look forward to the Q&A part of our discussion today.
Thank you, Joylette, and much appreciated for your words. We're going to transition now to Hannah Smith-Brubaker, Executive Director for the Pennsylvania Association for Sustainable Agriculture. Hannah?
Thank you. Thank you, Peter, and Grant. Thanks also to my co-presenters, Jackie and Joylette, and all those taking time during this complex time to listen. I also want to thank Penn State for making all of this possible. Before I begin, I wanted to just make a few comments about PASA. In 1992, PASA began as a conference convened by farmers who were very concerned about the future of farming. From the very beginning, these pioneering growers established an organization with sustainable agriculture and sustainable communities at its heart. and it had a strong commitment to develop, support, and promote sustainable food and farming systems that are economically viable, environmentally sound, and community focused. Over our 29 years, we've grown to serve more than 60,000 people who are committed to stewarding our environment, food, and communities. First slide, please. So this evening, I'm going to talk about resilient farming systems serving as a key strategy for addressing climate change. I should mention, though, before I start, that in addition to heading up PASA, I am also a farmer myself. Nearly all the photos you will see in my presentation today are from my farm, and much of what I'll talk about impacts me on a personal level, as well as the many other farmers that I support. Next slide. With 750 million farmers in the world, it is estimated that even without the cooperation of non-agricultural industry, the world's farmers, farming with best management practices, could make tremendous progress toward addressing climate change. According to the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, the most practical and cost-effective way to remove excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is through living plants and soils. Farmers and landowners can sequester tons of carbon per acre in soil and perennial biomass through best management practices for soil health, crop, and livestock production and agroforestry. Research has demonstrated that agroecological farming and ranching systems, including organic, sustainable, conservation agriculture, and even permaculture, can sequester and reduce direct agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. Though conventional agriculture, and by this I simply mean the conventions of today's agriculture, often overlook their potential, cover cropping, diversifying crops, agroforestry, silvopasturing, rotational grazing, and transitioning to perennial systems holds great promise for sequestering carbon and otherwise mitigating the risks associated with climate change. Next slide, please. We know that farmers are both on the front line of mitigating climate change and the most vulnerable to it. Climate change poses multiple adverse effects on agriculture, including intensified droughts, floods and storms, stresses on crops, livestock, and farm workers, disruption of seasonal flowering and fruiting in crops, shifting pest, weed, and disease life cycles, and disproportionate impacts on economically vulnerable communities. All of these effects eventually make their way into the marketplace and onto your plate in terms of availability, pricing, nutrition, and taste. Next slide. At the same time, farmers have been innovators and experimenters for millennia. A farm-based participatory approach to research, engaging citizens in science, can speed scientific discovery, democratize engagement in science, and potentially improve or influence the decisions that stakeholders make in light of science. Sustainable agriculture balances the needs of people, planet, and profit. PASA's work in citizen science on-farm research opens space for equity and empowerment. We are empowering farmers with data they value. Through a cohort-based peer-led learning approach, we are facilitating the connection of conventional row crop farmers, organic vegetable farmers, and pasture-based livestock farmers, all learning from each other. Next slide. One of the most important strategies that we can implement is to increase the number of days land is in living green cover for numerous benefits, like improving soil infiltration rates, thereby decreasing the compaction that would be happening as rain otherwise would be hitting bare earth, controlling erosion and evaporation rates, keeping soil temperatures hospitable to soil biology, improving nearby water quality by acting as a filter and providing food and habitat for pollinators, wildlife, and livestock, and importantly, harvesting carbon dioxide to feed the soil food web. We know that carbon sequestration presents a tremendous opportunity for organic and other ecologically based farmers to lead the way by following management practices that can help farmers adapt to climate change through strengthening agroecosystems. Next slide. Soil tillage practices have a profound influence on the physical properties of soil and the greenhouse gas balance. With conservation-minded tillage, which means disturbing the soil as little as possible, we reduce erosion, ponding, crusting, and soil organic matter depletion. Yet on farms primarily raising vegetables, it can be very difficult to eliminate tillage, which means we must use mulching, compost, and otherwise compensate for our actions. Where low and zero tillage is possible, we can minimize emissions of greenhouse gases from soils and contribute to efforts to mitigate against climate change. Next slide. Animals and plants and the soil that they build work synergistically, each playing its role in a beneficial cycle. As a vegetable farmer, I know that vegetables remove nutrients from the soil, whereas the animals on our farm return those nutrients. When we remove animals from the land, we remove an important part of that synergistic relationship. Through managed grazing, animals feed in place, but with limits on their impact on the land, playing an important role in recycling nutrients, managing weeds, and eliminating the need for isolated manure management, an important issue for water quality concerns. Next slide. We know that long ago, when soil only supported forests and grasslands, before we cleared it to grow crops, it stored a lot of carbon. By farming the land, we released that carbon. Deep perennial roots, undisturbed by deep tillage, are key to rebuilding soil organic matter and cycling the nutrients that can aid in sequestering carbon. So conservation-minded farmers are using cover crops, reduced tillage, and no-till to grow organic matter. Next slide. Diversity is always our best insurance policy against risk. And we know that with a changing climate, we will be facing risks that we cannot even imagine at this point. We know that when we plant diverse cover crops, integrate animals, seek out diverse markets for our products, plant a diversity of production crops, when nature serves up short-term droughts or deluges of rain, we are then better equipped to weather the storm, and if we do experience loss, to count on other crops and enterprises to be able to fill the gaps. As climate change presents more and more unpredictable weather patterns, if we are to ensure a steady food supply, farmers who are entrepreneurs by nature increasingly must be nimble and responsive. Next slide. There are myriad co-benefits of ecologically based approaches. Living roots and living cover help the soil soak up quickly and make fields more resilient through even some of the most intense rainfalls. Organic matter then works to soak up water and meter it out gradually during drier periods, all the while sequestering carbon dioxide through the process of photosynthesis. We know, for example, that every additional inch of soil organic matter increases a field's ability to soak up to 20,000 gallons more per acre of water. Think of that the next time it rains. With nearly 8 million acres in farmland in Pennsylvania, even focusing on building soil on 1% of our farmland could increase absorption by 1.4 billion gallons of rain. Think of the implications for preserving precious resources needed by PEMA and FEMA in the coming increased precipitation our state stands to experience in the coming decades. Next slide. As we all learned in elementary school, plants use photosynthesis to convert carbon dioxide into food so they can grow. This image from UCAR depicts a cycle where plants breathe and perspire. They help cool the atmosphere. Plants consume carbon dioxide in the process of photosynthesis. The reduction of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has an indirect cooling effect. And plants also cool the atmosphere because they release water vapor when they get hot, a process similar to sweating. Over a forest canopy or a vast expanse of grassland, large amounts of transpiration can markedly increase water vapor in the atmosphere, causing more precipitation and cloud over an area. The additional cloud cover often reinforces cooling by blocking sunlight. And because of these processes, many researchers believe plants may have a sizable impact on the global climate in the future. Next slide. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, as global temperatures rise and weather patterns become more erratic, the intersection between climate change and agriculture is crucial to understanding the role that farmers play in contributing to and mitigating global warming. So in closing, I'll end where I began. The most practical and cost-effective way to remove excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is through living plants and soils. Because soil organic matter is built with carbon drawn out of the atmosphere by living plants, organic and other ecologically based farming systems serve to be key to any global climate change drawdown plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Terrific presentation. I don't know if you guys have been following along, but you have quite the fan clubs in the chat section. So you are all to be commended for terrific presentations. So just to kind of begin the next segment here, a little question and answer. I'd ask the audience to start to be able to chime in either through the chat function or through the Q&A. And Peter will be able to help facilitate those questions, and then I'll be able to take stock and ask them appropriately. Maybe just to begin, kind of a couple of context setting questions for folks, and we can answer maybe in order of presentation. So Jackie, Joylette, and then Hannah. If you could maybe give an assessment of where we are at in Pennsylvania in terms of the challenges that we are facing with regards to climate, and in your own kind of estimation, how are we doing in terms of addressing that challenge? Joylette, you talked a lot about kind of the need for collective action. Jackie, you talked about political action. And Hannah, you talked about kind of the need of the partnerships and on the ground kind of, community-based approaches. Maybe starting with Jackie, your first assessment of Pennsylvania and kind of where we're at currently in this challenge.
Sure. Well, so to the extent that, state policy has the power to drive some really important legislation to remove barriers around existing problems, our legislature is largely anti-environmental. So, the state of affairs there is not good. Now, having said that, we should definitely not overlook Governor Wolf's executive order in the fall of this past year, announcing that he was entering Pennsylvania into the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So essentially, this is pricing carbon, which could go a long way in terms of cutting emissions from fossil fuel sources here in Pennsylvania. So shout out for Reggie, bad marks across the board on the state level. Some promising things happen on the local level with some of our mayors doing some really good things, but on balance, we got a long way to go.
Great, thank you. Joylette?
Yeah, just to tag off of what Jackie was saying, I think there has been some good and promising movement in terms of development of the state climate action plan, the update to the state climate action plan, the joining of Reggie, and some of the legislation that's moving. But it is challenging because we do have we have a lot of things that are also moving that are very They're very challenging from the promotion of extractive industry and the impact that that is likely to have on our climate. I think that one of the things that I kind of grapple with in doing the work that I was talking about around shaping the narrative for what our possible future could look like, and kind of some different paths that we could take in terms of investing in clean energy, investing in energy efficiency, and the jobs that that can bring. And that narrative, I think, is really important to continue to further. We have a lot of communities across the state, certainly in the southwestern part of the state, that are and have been, in some pretty challenging places economically. And certainly the current era of COVID-19 is only adding to those stresses. And so I think that more than ever, it's really important to have a practical path for us to build sustainable economic development for these communities, to really start to help people see what that narrative that leads us to the sustainable, climate-friendly future actually looks like.
Excellent. Thank you. Hannah?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, on the one hand, we know that in this last year, Auditor General DePasquale put out a kind of how ready is Pennsylvania for, excuse me, addressing climate change. And at least from the State Department perspective, the report wasn't very promising. And so he made some pretty significant recommendations for proactively addressing the infrastructure needs that we will need to be able to more proactively address what needs addressing right now. At the same time, I would say that on the ground, farmers in general are really realizing what an important role in stewardship they play. And, you mentioned that in terms of PASA serving or providing community-based approaches to this issue, so much of what we're doing right now, unfortunately, and maybe I think you mentioned before that we might move into talking a little bit about COVID, so much of what we do is on the ground and on farms with farmers, and with what we're going through right now with social distancing. Many of the farmers that are new to things like testing soil are having to sort of figure that out on their own. We have developed some webinars to help with that, but farmers that have at least had the opportunity to be in our research study for a few years have now gotten that down, that they're able to do it themselves on their own farms. But certainly not being able to be present with each other can serve as an impediment.
Great, thank you. We're getting a lot of questions coming in here, so I'm going to give every speaker kind of an opportunity and to basically kind of disseminate these individually here. And if you can give relatively kind of condensed and brief remarks, and some of the questions I'm going to take the liberty to paraphrase them. They're well formulated, but just for brevity's sake. The first one is a simple one. I'm going to ask Jackie for you to answer this. It's a simple but complex question, which is, how dangerous is burning coal towards the atmosphere? You shared a lot of your personal experiences growing up in kind of anthracite coal country. Maybe would you be able to reflect and share a little bit about the impacts of coal?
Well, I mean, I walked us through the impacts on the land, on our water, on our health, significant. As far as a fossil fuel that is killing our climate, the burning of coal is the #1 culprit, and that's why it's so essential that that cord be cut without any further delay.
The next one is, Joylette, I'm going to kind of pivot to you on this one. You know, the question is really around kind of the balance between individual private freedoms and the market versus how do we build a progressive role for government? What can governments do to kind of tackle some of these challenges, or is it really up to us as kind of individuals to solve this?
Okay, so that's a great question. And what I hear in that is kind of a question I've been getting for a number of years around climate change, about what is the solution, a top-down solution, or is the solution a bottom-up solution? And my answer to that has always been yes. We absolutely need kind of both directions of effort. This is really an all hands on deck moment. You know, I think, for instance, you know, I know there's a lot of younger folks tuning in to this broadcast tonight, and the youth climate movement has been so invigorating and so important in drawing attention and galvanizing the issue. But it's not just up to the young people, right? It's up to all of us, really, to engage from all of our various places in the structure, inside, outside the system, to, you know, make sure this is a societally important issue. I think that at the same time, you know, back to what I was saying before about, you know, the narrative that needs to be developed, I think that this is also something that has to make practical sense, right? So I think that, you know, when you start talking about individuals and the roles of markets, I think that there also has to be a story there that makes economic sense, that is plausible, that is a practical path for us to take. And I think that individuals have a role in driving that as much as leaders have a role in making that case and making that, taking those steps towards leadership. I mean, we have this is, you know, been talked about in many ways as an experiment, you know, that we're doing with our atmosphere right now. And, you know, I think that we need to be able to be creative and innovative in the space that's going to improve the situation.
Awesome, thank you. Next question is about, you know, how can citizens get engaged? And, you know, Hannah, I'm going to ask you that question about citizen engagement, because food has really been front and center in the past couple of days and weeks. And do you have suggestions or thoughts on how people not only can connect with nature and know their farmer, but, you know, kind of understand food systems and get more engaged from that aspect?
Sure. Well, hopefully people will reach out to organizations like PASA, or, for example, Buy Fresh, Buy Local, or any of the sort of local food system support networks. If you're just outside of Pennsylvania in the Delmarva region, Future Harvest CASA is a like organization to PASA. Really, again, this touches a little bit on, you know, what's impacted by COVID, but typically my answer would be to get to know your local farmer. Mm-hmm. One of the things we've seen during COVID-19 is that some of the larger producers that have fairly complex distribution systems have a good deal of impediment to actually getting their product to market right now, whereas farmers that are selling direct to consumer have a little bit more easy access right now in terms of getting that product on people's plates. It's really important to know that in Pennsylvania, according to Governor Wolf's really important guidance, that farms are considered essential businesses, as are farmers markets. So please know that as an alternative to grocery stores, nothing wrong with a grocery store, but being able to go to your local farmers market and be able to get what we hope is, you know, pre-packed from a farmer available to you at a farmer's market can be an important part of making sure that you're having access to healthy foods.
Awesome, thank you. Jackie, you mentioned the governor signing on to RGGI. And there's a question about kind of assigning a price to carbon and how important that is. Can you share some insights on kind of the regional greenhouse gas initiative, and what will some of the benefits be for Pennsylvanians with the governor signing on to that regional initiative?
Yeah, so the initiative has been up and running for quite a long time now. I believe 13 states in the Northeast are in the consortium, if you will, and quite a few states are down the road on their program. Basically requiring industry to pay a price on carbon pollution will do a couple things. Number one, it'll actually create a pretty nice pot of money that could then be deployed around other climate positive initiatives. And then secondarily, that price on carbon essentially is a disincentive for polluting industries to exceed their cap, and that is essentially the disincentive, or that's essentially the mechanism that ultimately results in fewer emissions, particularly climate-killing emissions, but that also have ancillary benefits of just improving the air quality in general for Pennsylvanians.
Terrific. The next one is tailor-made for you, Joylette. How do you think we can better communicate about climate change? You've had some experience for a few years kind of working directly on that issue. Can you share some of your lessons learned and maybe some insights?
Sure. Well, let's see. The first thing I would say is, and this used to actually be one of my catchphrases, is that we're not going to depress people into action. So if you're looking to communicate effectively about climate change, it's really important to paint a vision for what you're trying to drive towards. You know, I think a lot of the facts about climate are very scary and they're very big, but that has a tendency, especially depending on who you're talking to. I mean, depending on where people are when they get this information, that can definitely shut down the conversation. But I would say also just, you know, talking about climate isn't really so different than talking about anything else, in the sense that you want to, you know, meet people where they are. And climate change is one of those issues that it touches so many different things that you have the opportunity to really come at it from a number of different angles, and really, you know, have a rich conversation with folks about the economics, about the public health consequences, about the equity issues. You know, there's a lot to talk about. And so I think that finding the things that are really gonna engage the folks that you're talking with are important. So there's a lot more to say about that, and I'm watching just some really excellent questions roll by on a number of different things about getting parent voices involved in the conversation, about, you know, different solar panels and their cost, the cost of technology. You know, there's so many good questions. So I'm sorry that you don't have time to take them all, I'm sure, but it's really good to see. The other thing I did want to add, though, back to the RGGI question, is not to downplay, you know, the potential benefits economically for the state as a consequence of that too. The states that have engaged in RGGI so far have seen job growth, you know, and Pennsylvania already has 90,000 clean energy jobs in renewables and energy efficiency, so, and other vehicle transit, things like that. So we should not discount the potential economic benefits too.
Good point. Jackie, you were talking a little bit, maybe just to build off Joylette's kind of point there. There's a question here about House Bill 1100, which will give tax credits to more ethane cracker plants. And you brought this up in your presentation about the engagement with Royal Dutch Shell. This issue about balancing kind of the response, the immediate response for jobs, like how do we, particularly now in this economic climate that we have fallen into, how do we balance kind of that the long-term benefits of reducing that other tiny little molecule, carbon dioxide, that has done so much damage, and providing economic opportunity for folks. Can you address that, please?
Sure. So we believe that the recovery, the post-COVID economic recovery, we have an opportunity for that to largely be defined by green jobs. There are so many opportunities in Pennsylvania to put our union brothers and sisters, anyone who's working for family sustaining wages, to work in industries that don't require them to essentially sacrifice their bodies and their health the way that the fossil fuel industry does. Let's just take, for example, the two largest industries in Pennsylvania, tourism and agriculture. Both these industries are going to take a huge hit. Those are the industries that we need to be bailing out. Those are the industries that we need to be helping. Small businesses affiliated with both of those sectors absolutely are going to need a hand up. And if we instead pass House Bill 1100, which will be an open-ended tax subsidy for the petrochemical industry for 30 years. If the stimulus money ends up going to that industry, just the sheer cost of what those subsidies look like, Shell getting $1.65 billion. Think of what directing that kind of money to other sectors that are much greener, much more sustainable at the end of the day. Create a much more diverse economic set of scenarios for Pennsylvania. We think that that's the opportunity before us now, and really hope that that our elected officials listen to our thoughts about green stimulus and green jobs and the framework they're in.
Terrific, thank you. Hannah, I'm going to bundle two questions for you here. One is about kind of the engagement of indigenous perspectives and the utilization of restorative agriculture. The other is about, does PASA have collaborations with other farmers in other states where there's kind of learning growing across borders? You'll have to unmute yourself there.
Sorry, in full disclosure, I live in a rural area with no high-speed internet, and I have 4 college-age kids all taking courses online while we're doing this webinar. So, yeah, so one of the things that is important to remember is, we didn't invent, for example, organic agriculture here in the US. Ecological farming is what most of the farming for all history has been. It has really only been a very recent thing that we have viewed farming to be somehow in conflict with stewardship or conservation of resources. And so if any of you has been to our conference, which is a gathering of about 2,200 people every year, there's a lot of diversity of thought in that place, and that is our strength. So even though there's sort of a broad range of agricultural practices available today, we really see that the knowledge and experience of our elders. If my children decide to farm, they'll actually be fourth generation organic farmers. And Pennsylvania really is a stronghold for organic farming, but we've learned from the many people throughout history that know that working in harmony with nature is what does, for example, preserve soil so that we can continue to grow. So beyond that, yes, PASA at our conference has people from all over the world attending, and we have very regular interactions with farmers in other states, with researchers in other states, with farmers conducting research on their farm in other states. It's the power of that peer-led network where we recognize that when people get together, even from very diverse backgrounds, but are coming together for the common good of making sure that we have healthy soils, ability to grow food for our children, preservation of natural resources, there's this sort of commonality that puts aside some of our discriminations against each other's practices. I did want to mention one thing that came up a little bit earlier, and I noticed there was a question about the likelihood of giving farmers subsidies to capture carbon through sustainable practices. And so one of the things at PASA that we try to really focus on is on outcomes. If there's way that we can incentivize farmers based on actual outcomes, so what their soil tests are saying, how much organic matter they're growing, as opposed to necessarily a prescriptive set of practices. Along those lines, something like RGGI is very important. When we're talking about things like trade, we want to be careful that we're not disincentivizing really good practices up front and relying on sort of trading off where that's not happening. I think that's all I'll say about that.
Great. Thank you very much.
So I want to thank all of you for being here this evening. I know there are so many questions. I see a bunch of them in the queue here, but I know that we need to be respectful of people's time. And I believe that Jackie is facing actually a deadline because she lives in Luzerne County. And we need to just be careful about, public safety and that we're doing what we can to make sure that people are safe. While, we might not hear it, I'm sure that we are hearing a lot of clapping right now because you guys were really fantastic. Yeah. So give yourselves, kind of rounds of applause for the presentations that you gave. I want to thank Grant for being the MC. It's great to have the city of Pittsburgh represented in that way. I want to thank Joylette, Jackie, and Hannah for being here because, we chose the three of you because you have been inspirations to people at the Sustainability Institute, and we knew that you would bring some really incredible things to the table. I want to let people know who asked questions that were not answered that the team at the Sustainability Institute, and I'm sure Grant, Joylette, Jackie, and Hannah are willing to respond to you, and we will put those into either one or a series of communications so that you can get the best information that you can, so that you can work as an individual or in your community or at the state level to affect the kind of change that we know needs to happen. So I want to thank you all again, the panelists, and I want to thank the people who are at home, who tuned in. There's a lot of work to do, and we're really excited to see what you all do, and we will be in touch.
Definitely. We thank you, Peter and the Penn State team for helping to bring us together today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
And you have a good night.
Good
Cheers.
night.